It's a great point on the community thing. I think that's one great thing about being in product and growth is we're all figuring it out. There's no best practices the way there are in other fields. Like it's all being written. It's all first principles. I found that just cold outbounding to other product leaders, just asking for help, which is what I did when I switched to product. I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing. Can you help me? The hit rate is surprisingly high. Like people want to be helpful. It's hard. And no one knows what they're doing.
Welcome to the Product Tea with Leah. I am your host, Leah Darin, and we are about to spill the tea with the best from tech about product growth and senior leadership topics. Good morning, everyone. He is the mind behind Mixpanel's easy-to-scale product analytics, where he serves as the head of product. With a rich history at Mixpanel spanning over 8 years, he has helmed various engineering and product teams, significantly shaping the company's analytics capabilities from product to engineering. He was originally a software engineer on Uber's data team and crafted solutions for the Amazon search infrastructure team at A9.com. And today, he will have a very interesting talk with me about PLG. Welcome to the Product Tea, Vijay Iyengar. How are you doing this morning?
Doing well. How are you, Leah?
Did I pronounce your name absolutely correct, or did I not?
You did it perfectly. Thank you.
I am so proud of myself. Thank you so much for coming to the Product Tea.
Of course, happy to be here.
So can you introduce yourself with anything that I just forgot, or is this a relatively good summary?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good summary. Yeah, maybe the one interesting thing I always mention is that, I joined Mixpanel about 8 years ago as an engineer and then did engineering management for several of our backend infrastructure teams. And now I'm, pretty far from engineering as head of product. And so that's been kind of an interesting journey of going from working on our backend to spending all my time with customers and not writing that much code.
That is really cool. And I would like to talk about it as well a little bit. But before we do that, what do people get wrong about you once they get to know you?
Yeah, I think given my engineer background, I'm, quite analytical and technical and can be quite serious about things in an async context, like in, writing a doc or proposal or something like that. But I also, one of my colleagues says this best of, we're building a B2B SaaS product. We're not saving lives. So I also just like to be lighthearted at work, just make jokes about things, like keep things light. And so I think that people might find that surprising as, when they just interact with me async, but synchronously, I just like to have fun and kind of keep things light, even when discussing serious topics. And I think you just do better work that way. So that's probably one thing that's the most surprising to people.
So what you're saying is we should not get into an ice bath at 5:30 in the morning just to get the day started before we code anything or like before we analyze any data. Is that what you're saying? So you're saying all the standards that I'm living by from LinkedIn are not necessarily correct.
Yeah. You need to look at the sun, step on dirt, barefoot. No. Yeah, I think you just got to live your best life, do whatever works for you. I don't know. But I will say this, I don't believe in taking yourself too seriously. So, yeah.
Okay, that's good, because we're going to talk about something quite serious today. I've been talking my entire adult life about PLG. It was one of my first words that I actually uttered as a baby too. So you've been in the industry for some time, and you've been in the industry also on a couple of different sides as well. Also Mixpanel for 8 years. It's rare that I have people who stay longer in their gigs than 3 years. So not going into that too much, but I feel like it's fair to say that you're a veteran, right? Like you've seen things. It sounds to me a little bit like you're immune to the hype. And whenever someone comes around the corner with something really amazing, you're just like, okay, maybe we could check it out, but let's take it easy for a moment. So in the pre-talk, I asked you what we should talk about. And we settled on the topic, PLG, we're kind of over it, or it's dead. Just trying to sensationalize it a little bit here. What is your take on PLG or product-led growth in general right now? And why would you say at Mixpanel, a company that also profits from PLG in B2B specifically, something as outrageous as that?
Yeah. First of all, I don't think PLG is dead, although I can see the Substack title now. It's panning out.
Yeah, it's over. This is the episode, yeah.
But I do think it's potentially overrated. And I do feel like that's starting to become more of a mainstream take, especially with this more, I wouldn't say recessionary environment, but an environment of slower growth. I think a lot of companies are realizing this. So why do I think it's overrated? I think where it's been overrated is this sense that PLG is for everyone and for every company and for every business. And if you're not doing PLG, you're doing something wrong. Just want to say to all the founders of startups out there that if you're not doing PLG, I don't think you're necessarily doing something wrong. Quite possibly you're doing something right. It's just a way to think about efficient acquisition for your business. And some businesses, it makes sense, particularly ones that are building for developers or building for other high growth startups. I think there's a very organic PLG story to have there. But I think there's plenty of businesses that can monetize much better and grow much better, focusing on a different segment of the market where PLG isn't the appropriate sales motion, right? Products that are harder to set up, products that only make sense when deployed wall to wall within an organization, it doesn't really make sense to start, with a foot in the door with one tiny team because you're not even showcasing the primary value. And then if you try to do both, I think there's this whole product-led sales thing for a bit. I think you have to be really careful there because you're constantly towing the line between what you're doing for the smaller self-serve end of your market, which is almost a different company and a different business. A lot of customers, low ACV, potentially very churny. And then compare that with what you're doing for your high end of the business, which is very few customers, very high ACV, and a completely opposite way of supporting them and margin structure and all of those things. So I guess a couple of points. I don't think it's dead. I think it's overrated. I don't think if you're not doing PLG, you're doing something wrong. I think you just have to evaluate who you're going after and whether it makes sense. And I think if you try to do both PLG motion and an enterprise motion, you have to be really careful to not, but for every initiative you do, you ask like, who is it for and which side is it for? Because you can often end up with something that's not good for either. And yeah, plenty of scar tissue about like navigating that dynamic.
So I think you said a lot of things that were quite interesting. Let me just translate it a little bit and then you tell me whether I'm reflecting you correct. So what I think is, what you also said is that businesses who are too horizontal, like they cover too much of a spectrum of a market, which is kind of like what we're saying here, because every motion is for an ideal kind of part of the market. Product-led sales is really good in the mid-market where you have this natural mixture between, like driving the CAC down at any cost, which is where a lot of businesses fall into right now. Now we have the enterprise segment, of course, where just sales is probably still the way to go. And then the other side, like the down market peasants, where PLG is the only option that you probably have. So I think I do agree with this. I think what the story is mostly about right now is how to learn how to do good growth. Because specifically, if you as a company need to learn how to sell yourself, so people are even looking at your stuff, because this is probably the bigger problem, then something interesting is happening. I think I mostly agree with what you said, also in the sense, like, if I look at how my cohort programs have changed over the years and the things that I teach about PLG, I actually teach about interactive demos. Because for most people, PLG is like freemiums. Yeah. And I disagree. I really, really disagree. I just do not think you should do freemiums exactly as an enterprise motion, but I can almost not see any reason why you should not even have at least an interactive demo with tracking, which goes back to the point. I do think while you do not have to do PLG full-blown freemium and so forth, you should have tracking for everything that you do, especially in sales motions where you have enterprise clients, because you have so few users that you should track the little things that you can actually do at the top of your funnel. And that's, I think for me, that's a bit of a, how do you say, like a lost opportunity? Or
totally. No, I completely agree with the way you're thinking about it, because it sounds like you're saying, hey, we should unbundle this big monolith called PLG into the constituent pieces that are valuable, right? And I think one of them that you mentioned is, I think, a big reason that PLG took off in the first place is this shift from, you sell a product and then your customers use it, to your customers use it and then you sell them. And I think the latter has a bunch of benefits. It forces you to think about the onboarding and self-serve experience and make it really a delightful product.
Yeah.
It builds trust with customers who've come to expect an experience. Like, I'm not going to put down a check for $200,000 until I've at least tried it or played with it, or built a sense that it works. And it just forces you to show value up front. I think those things are actually really valuable elements of PLG that don't even require you to have a full-blown motion, like you said. So yeah, 100% agree. Like, unbundling the good ideas from it and just thinking about what works. I think that one is almost table stakes at this point. Like, everyone should have a product that people can experience in some form before they transact, because that's becoming a customer expectation. So yeah, totally agree with that.
So here's a question to you. Like, if we think about, maybe I should not call my course PLG, maybe it's just like how to do growth. I don't know. But if we think about it as a step function in terms of, like, you have different tools, you have interactive demos, you sometimes have freemiums, you have ungated freemiums. That's a really cool thing that I also saw from Rose, like where you just get on the website and there's no login and you can use the product. It's really cool. You have trials, so you have all these different tools. And we're now here and we're saying, like, okay, like, even if you have an interactive demo, you need to use some kind of data. Mixpanel is a very interesting product because you are in a market where it's really about the value that you generate is coming from the more data that is being tracked, the more potential value we can actually source out of it. When are you thinking that someone is too big or like too far up market? Not too big, sorry, like too far up market in the market where you just say, like, hey, you know what? Like, you do not need an analytics tool. You need something completely else. Like, you should rely only on qualitative insights for anything that you do. because it is an interesting market to me, because we've seen a couple of companies go belly up that were also trying to do analytics for sales teams specifically, right? Like correlated does not exist anymore and so forth. And I've been looking at it from this perspective, and it was very interesting to me to kind of see like what's happening. Do you have any perspective in this regard? Because this is something that really fascinates me.
Yeah. So you've got a bunch of subpoints there that are really good. I'll just go one by one. So the first thing you're asking is, hey, is there a point where Mixpanel, somebody outscales it? I actually see it kind of the inverse. Like I think at very, very small scales, like you're just trying to find product market fit. You have so few users or potential users. Analytics is not that helpful because you'll just see a graph of like, oh, one person used my product today. Like that's not as helpful as just going and talking to that one person. So I'd say until you get your first few hundred recurring users, as a founder, you should probably be talking to all of them and getting qualitative insight from all of them, because you're trying to figure out what your product even is. It's changing so fast. Like a time series of how people are using a feature may not even make sense because that feature didn't exist 2 months ago. So I think early stage, I think we do see that quite a bit, which is people don't need analytics, and I think it's overkill. You need it for basic, like, did my app break, and is that why no one's showing up? Or I blew up on product hunt, am I actually converting those users? I think it's useful for that kind of thing. So it's just a good basic setup. But I think it's not as valuable as qualitative. As you scale, the qualitative becomes overwhelming. And so then you do need to have these key indicators of, how is my product performing across all these different areas? I think the one shift we actually do see from when we're selling Mixpanel to small teams versus larger teams is in smaller teams, there's the developer who's adding the tracking and building the features, and then the person making decisions about what to build. And in really tiny teams, they're the same person. It's the founder. As you scale a little bit, then you have, your first product team, you have a PM and then a few engineers, and they sit really close to each other and like look at each other, and it's really aligned. As you scale more and more, you have many of these individual teams that might be working on completely independent surface areas, and a new need emerges. And that need is from the VP of product or the CPO. And they're trying to understand, okay, every quarter, every 6 months, across all of this portfolio of my product, how are all these investments performing? Which ones should I kill? Which ones should I double down on? How do I even standardize how we look at data in the whole organization? And that's almost a different product experience than, Mixpanel for startups, where it's just like people are just throwing tracking in and seeing what happens. That's more about sort of thinking about your business as a tree. It's like, okay, we're trying to drive revenue. Revenue breaks down into our top of funnel, our conversion rate, our ACV, and our net expansion. Net expansion breaks into churn rate and then selling other things. I've got teams for each of those things. How are they doing, and how does that ladder up? And then segment that. Like, where do we have a problem? Go slice and dice that and do that analysis. That's the bigger need from enterprises that we see from an analytics standpoint. And right now a lot of them are using BI tools to do that. What's even more common is they use some combination of SQL, Google Sheets, and Google Slides. They have a million untitled worksheets floating around their company. That's like where all their metrics live, which is crazy to me. So I think that's actually the big shift we see, is like moving from individual teams where it's like very high trust. You just like turn to the left and say, hey, can we track this thing? To these larger organizations where it's actually about understanding how everything contributes up. And that's where we're increasingly seeing the need on enterprise. Now, where I was kind of getting at is, like, if we were to just look at our customer base and take all the feedback in, there's 10x more startups than there are enterprises. And within enterprises, there's 10x more IC product managers than there are executives. And so if we just looked at all our feedback and said, what are most people telling us to do? We would bias to building the first product of just keep making it like iteratively better for PMs and analysts to track data. But if we want to go crack enterprise, which we're doing and we have demand from, we have to actually just focus on like the 1%, which is the people that are ready to deploy wall to wall. So I think that's kind of how we internally are struggling with this. Do we just continue to capture all these startups, which we do want to do, and then do we go enterprise? It's like almost two different products.
Yeah. No, I 100% agree. And I find it very interesting because at this particular scale, so let's just say like I would imagine that a typical client of yours that is coming to you in this particular upmarket segment has about 100 to 150 employees. And they say like, hey, we need to get a grip on our data. It is a fucking mess. We do not know how to get it right. And what they're talking about is usually that these people are usually quite good on financial performance data. Every CEO that I know, every CFO that I know, hopefully the CFOs, but like also most CPOs and so forth, they have a relatively good grip around how does our business perform, financials and so forth, because you usually add that this side also, like, you need to get your shit in order to get VC funding, which is the reality for a lot of these companies and so forth. But when we talk about the product usage data, because this is also what they're talking about often. So like, hey, we need to unify everything. Like the entire data stack needs to like happen, I don't know, like in Snowflake or whatever it is. It's a huge mess. And it's very, very difficult to kind of get this all together. What would be your advice if someone says like, hey, I understand in principle data, and I want to know what's going on in my company. And the usual question that they have is like, hey, how does what we do at the bottom connect with the revenue that we make at the top? So like what is being built in the product, which is the first step to kind of let go of control and not becoming like a directive, like, oh, you need to do this exactly, instead of just saying like, hey, here's the strategy, and then you do something. What is your frame of mind there in the sense of like, hey, what is the first step? Like, what should someone actually do that is coming from a company like this and is thinking about like, hey, how can I actually learn about how does all of that work?
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you asked that, because I think that's actually the second big shift that's a positive shift from PLG, which is getting the product teams to stop just thinking about what surface area of the product I'm working on and start thinking about what business impact I'm driving, right? And I think in some businesses, it's very straightforward. You have some transaction or conversion moment that's revenue oriented. You can just say, like, if you're working on, Airbnb or DoorDash or something like that, it's just, okay, are we driving more gross order value or trips booked or nights booked? That's a very clear revenue driver. Everything you do should drive that thing. I think, so you asked what's my advice on that. I think you're right, that the executive team has a really good grip on the financial metrics. And as a business, ultimately, you're trying to optimize for share price, and share price boils down to revenue minus cost. I think revenue ends up being kind of like, okay, what are we doing to move revenue on some medium to long-term horizon? I think it's incumbent on the product leader, maybe in combination with the head of analytics or head of data, to define some model of how things ladder up to revenue. So I was mentioning it for B2B. I actually think it's quite straightforward for B2B, where you have revenue breaks down into your pipeline. That could be organic, it could be product-led pipeline, it could be demand generation, whatever it is. You've got pipeline, you've got your conversion rate, like how much of that pipeline are you closing? You've got the ACV, and then you've got net retention, right? Mathematically, those four things, you move some combination of them, they should multiply and become your revenue. Now, of course, you need to understand for your business, like, are you a very land and expand type business? Are you like very multi-product? That you can kind of build a sensitivity model or understand, like, where is most of your growth going to come from? Like, for example, Rippling, very compound product. I think they have like 140, 150% net retention rate because they're selling you 50 SKUs. Cool. That's like part of your strategy is how you expand. Other products are more, hey, we'll just capture all of the startups that are out there, and then we'll like gradually organically scale with them as they grow, whatever it is. But I think you got to define that. It's usually a tree style thing. In consumer, it might be a loop, though I think even loops are somewhat overrated. It's usually a tree. And then you look at that and you say, okay, what you need to do segmentation and understand what's broken in this. What are the problems? What are the opportunities? Probably need to do that every quarter, every 6 months. Like, okay, is pipeline good enough to hit our revenue goals? If it's not, where is it bad? And then what should we do about it? And then each of the product teams should be oriented around some product bet you're making to drive one of those things. For example, let's say that your organic pipeline is bad because your SEO is terrible. Like, you're just not ranking on anything. Or, your website is really not optimized for conversion, so nobody's able to find out how to contact your sales team. And you've root cause, that's the problem. Then you can spin up a team and say, hey, you're working on optimizing our website flow. The reason that matters is that'll help us convert more pipeline. The reason that matters is that'll lead to revenue. And I think just having that structure, like starting with that instead of starting with what data do we have sitting in Snowflake, let's go, like try to analyze all of it. It's better to just start from the business and the structure, and the data is the means to the end. And then I think the last thing is using tooling that gets everybody to self-serve and look at that. Like, I think one of the things it's the thing Marty Kagan has been saying for a long time, and you mentioned as well. It's like leading with context, not control, right? And I think engineers move 10x faster when they're connected to how is what I'm doing going to make my shares worth more versus I'm just doing this thing that's Jira ticket. So it's like, do you have a way to get this data out to everybody in your company that they understand? Okay, I'm shipping this feature and it ladders up this way. So I think just orienting around that, and then the tooling just becomes a means to the end. Like, yeah, you could be writing SQL and Snowflake. You could use Mixpanel to analyze it. That's kind of what is the easiest thing to do.
So I agree with this, but there's one key thing in there where I have not found a uniform first principles answer. And I think what it really is about is everything that you said is correct. We need to analyze, we need to improve something in the entire pipeline from, hey, someone hears about our product until we close. There's a lot of intermediate steps, whether you're focusing more on the self-serve part or closing, all of this is fine. One of the most common questions that I have from people in general is, hey, Leah, here's our number. is it bad? And about something, right? Like in the business, like, hey, here's the conversion rate. Here's how many people did we convert. Like, do we charge too much? Do we charge too little? And so forth. And what I mean with that is that unless you are quite experienced in probably even the same industry sometimes, or like you have insider knowledge about something, it's very hard for you to kind of figure out where the specific steps, so from A to B, is doing bad or whether it's actually doing already quite well and you should improve it. I'll give you a very specific example, which is maybe a little bit oversimplified. In a typical SMB business, or like where you sell from B2B, so like to smaller companies in the mid segment, we think about, hey, a 5 to 7% kind of conversion rate is relatively standard still. I'm still seeing this. This is just what I know from experience. Now, let's say you do not know that. You're looking at this number, and you might not even use Mixpanel or anything else, but like you can get to this number relatively quick. Probably every sales leader has this number, like, hey, this is how many people actually came into the funnel, and then this is how many we actually converted. No matter how much energy you put in there, you're not going to convert more than 7, maybe 8%. So like there's just a diminishing amount of return that is just happening. It's just the nature of the business that this is a number that seems to be somewhere where it seems to be correct. So I think a lot of this stuff comes down to the point of, can you prove in some kind of way that some kind of step is doing bad in the business? So I'll give you a good example, which I think is a really hidden opportunity. Just finding a big portion of the people who are unsatisfied with your product through a churn survey that you can do either quantitatively or qualitatively is very, very powerful. And this is what I encourage also product leaders and product managers alike to do. You don't need to understand the entire data stack. You just need to find some kind of opportunity where you do not have to put that much energy into it to actually fix it. You don't need to understand the entire business. You just need to understand, hey, if I do this particular thing, how is the top line going to move? And then we're landing back to where you were. So I think it's more about proving what's bad. I mean, proving, we're not scientists, right? You get my point.
Yeah, no,
right?
that makes complete sense. And actually, I love that you brought up the churn survey. I think that was one of the biggest drivers of Mixpanel improving its product from like 2018 onward. Our CPO, Neil, was at the time, we had this big churn problem. And I think he had this take that, okay, if you have a churn problem, that's the thing you need to focus on first, because then it doesn't matter how much you're growing or acquiring users, it's a leaky bucket. And these are users that you have every right to keep them, right? Like, obviously, some of those companies go out of business, so there's no way to keep them. But the ones that are churning and still have the burning need for your problem means you had the demand and you squandered it because your product was insufficient to solve their needs. And so then we looked at, okay, what are the top 5 reasons that people churn? And then let's go address those things and just wholly focus the company on that. And that got our retention rate from 60% to about 90% over the course of 2 years. So I completely agree with that. I think that's I think once you break down your business like that, at the first level from revenue breaks down to these 4 things, you need to identify which of those is the problem. I would say benchmarks are okay for that, but I agree with you. If churn is a problem, you almost want to drop everything else and just go focus on churn. It's probably my take. And try to get to set a higher bar than you think. Well, probably like 90% gross retention rate on that. Obviously, you should go look in, like if you're going after startups, of course, you're expecting some natural churn. But yeah, churn is really important. I think that's one. And if that's good, I think even growth, like let's say you made retention good. One thing that I think is underrated that should be done to understand growth is just your users' first 7 days or first window experience with your product. Because usually like retention, long-term retention, which is not, I think, a good input metric, but it's a good output metric, is defined by what a user experiences in their first day or week, whatever it is. And just segmenting your retention by saying, okay, how does retention differ for people who experience X versus Y in their first week? Or how many times do they have to do certain key actions in their first week to retain? And then also segmenting it demographically, like who is even likely to retain? Because don't waste your CAC dollars on something that's not your ICP. So I think those 2 things alone probably tell you more than most other things. And then of course, everything else you should go measure and test. But those are probably the 2 most helpful things for us, is looking at our churn, retention was bad. Why are people churning? Go solve that. And then who even is likely to retain in the first place, focus all our acquisition efforts on them. And then, just optimize for that, because that's our ICP.
I felt really clever the other day when I was thinking about churn on a 2-dimensional kind of way. So like the first one is exactly what you said, right? Like, so you analyze like who is churning from the product itself after they have a paid subscription with you or like some kind of paid engagement with you. But the other thing is also like this acquisition churn, where Henry Cruz from Rose actually brought me onto this. Like, I really love his take on this, where he said that if you have people or companies start to become power users, whatever your definition for that is, right? So like, hey, they're using a specific part of your product relatively intense, like, I don't know, the top 10 percentile or whatever, and they suddenly stop. Those are also excellent targets for getting feedback. And I want to emphasize as well, like really quickly, like why they are such a good feedback point rather than just like the existing customers that you have and the ones that are already using your product. Because if you go with what I said at the start, like where you have a 7% conversion rate and 93% of the people will never convert, that means you have much more data to play with and to prove. Also, what you are doing is statistically significant, at least in some kind of way, with people who are never becoming your paid customers. Because we know every paid customer has at some point been a non-paying customer. So you need to recruit them out of there from that particular perspective. So I really like this take as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. There's also, I like to think about your customer base as a set of concentric circles. Like there's the people who really get your product, get the need, they'll figure it out. They have a very high intent. And you need to make sure you have, it's to your point that those are the power users. You need to have high retention with them. If you don't have high retention with them, you've like really screwed up something core in your experience. Maybe it's really unreliable or buggy or something really core is bad. Once you have that core group, then I think your goal to grow is how do you push that out? Like, how do you find more people like them? How do you educate the people that are wandering out from the circle that maybe do have the problem, but are solution unaware or unaware of how to get set up? And again, you can reach out to them or do dedicated onboarding calls with 100 of them until you get a sense of how do you educate them and then design that into your product and then go one concentric circle out. Maybe the next circle wouldn't use you unless you have this other thing bundled in. And so you evaluate the size of that bundle. Like that's how great companies are built, is through that wedge, right? And it's even, you have to segment a lot to even understand that wedge. I think that's another great first project for doing analytics at your company, is just understanding who are those circles.
Yeah, cohort analysis, just following people around is very, very underappreciated. It's not just like segmenting like, hey, who is our ICP and who's not, but like really, no, follow someone, right? Like people that you have acquired in May because you did something, I don't know, like something crazy. Just follow them. Just see what happens with them afterwards. I think it's really unappreciated. So here's a very specific question. So you mentioned BI tools before, and I'm always a little bit suspicious about BI tools. And I also made some really outrageous claims 2 years, I think, on LinkedIn that got me a lot of hate mail. So what I did is like I said that, hey, I think as a good product manager, or like I'm trying to formulate it different now because I need to be careful. I think you will have a hard time to be really, really good in product if you do not know how to source data, aka if you do not know how to write SQL or understand how data is stored in some kind of basic way, how to join tables and so forth. You might not be able to have to do it yourself. Back then I wrote that you need to know SQL. So here's a question to you before I give you maybe my take. I don't know. I think BI tools, while they're not a bad way in terms of clicking together events, like, hey, how many customers with this particular attribute have given us revenue in the last 30 days? What they also do sometimes is they give an excuse to people to not engage with the technology behind, and then they do not know, as a product manager, for instance, how to check in your browser whether a specific event is being sent from the product that you are working on, and then just to check, like, what is the name, like, or is there a bug from the web browser? Is it being sent from the backend and so forth? Do you have a take on this? Because I've changed my opinion a little bit, but like just a little bit.
No, it's a great point. I think because BI tools are typically the only interface that most people have to their company's data, they view that as the end all be all. This is the way to get at the data. And I think it's one of those, that every tool is good at something and not good at other things. And I think what BI tools are great at is consumption. It's good when you've predefined a set of metrics and dimensions, and you want to push that out for general consumption.
If you know the question.
Yeah, exactly. You know the question, it's predictable, and you're just getting reports. It's a reporting interface, right? Reporting is great to just keep a pulse on things, but nobody ever found an insight from reporting, or nobody ever found something that's needle moving from a report. They just find out, something broke. We should go deal with that. The real work that needs to be done with data is analysis. Like the stuff that we're talking about is, analyze your retention rate to see where people drop off in the first week, or analyze which cohorts are more likely to be sticky or not, or that you should focus on. That's analysis. And a BI is not an analysis tool, it's a consumption tool, right? It'd be like using kind of a read-only website to like take notes or something. It just doesn't make sense. And so, I agree with you. So the bottleneck to analysis is on one hand tooling, but obviously we're biased, like that's what Mixpanel is solving. Like we're trying to be a self-serve analysis tool, not just a reporting tool. But the other thing is just the analytical mindset. So I think your take was that it's actually good friction to go to the source data and write the SQL because it forces you to grapple with how the data is modeled and stored and like forces you to really think critically. I think that's really important. I completely agree with that. To me, like actually knowing the syntax of SQL, it's like telling a programmer like you have to know Python or Ruby or some specific language. That yeah, sure, it's good to know if you like, but it's what's more important. I think is the analytical mindset of okay, what's the hypothesis you have, how will you evaluate against that hypothesis, and make sure you don't make classic correlation causation like issues, or you're actually like following a logical chain of thought. When to like analyze cohorts versus just analyze time period comparisons. Like it's that analytical literacy that I think is important. So then there's a question of how do you build that? I think one is just, you be the person that at your company, like when there's an open question, like, hey, why did this thing dip or spike? You're the one that goes and tries to answer it. And once you do that a few times, you'll build it. The other thing is like part of I do think it's an interface problem where there isn't a good interface for analysis. Like I don't think SQL is designed more to be easy for the computer to understand than to be easy for a human to work with, right? Like it's like a data structure that is for computers to parse, not for humans to parse. And usually analysis isn't just you write a SQL query and you're done. It's a series of follow-up questions. You get results, right? Like interrogating the data and sparring with the results. And it should be visual because the visual gives you so much rich, like, oh, this thing spiked on this day. You can't see that from a table, things like that. And so that's actually our core product vision and our thesis is that the event-based and visual model of analysis it is the right interface for analysis that can teach you how to do it well. The problem historically with event-based analysis tools like Mixpanel is that they didn't have access to all the data that you care about. Like it's only your product usage data, not your business data. That's been a big shift for us in the past year as we also connect now with Snowflake and BigQuery so you can marry the two and see both in one interface. So it's like, what if you could have access to the data that BI has, but an interface that enables analysis? That's exactly our vision, actually. So completely agree with the problem. I don't think we're close to solving it. It's a really, really hard problem and both a skill set and mindset and whatever. But I think at least on the technology side, we're trying to solve it. So yeah.
You know what it is? I think I look at it the same way in how we understand AI nowadays, or like machine learning in that sense. So like, or language model. Let's just go with a language model, right? So like a language model can only be as good as the data that you feed it. It's just, we call this data bias. Like this is the stuff that we're introducing. I have not met a single company, or I could not go into the data itself and see some really weird shit happening just because of a spelling mistake, an event triggering 4 times when it should only 1 time, and so forth. And I really do not know what the correct answer is. I think I've shifted from like, hey, you as a PM need to know SQL to at least someone in your team needs to be really good, but you still need to kind of understand like how data is kind of structured in some kind of way. It doesn't mean that you need to be a data scientist. I'm also neither, right? Like I'm not, like I'm really weak considering everything when it comes to quantitative data, but like I still do think I don't know how to learn it if you do not learn some kind of language that interfaces with it. It's like, you can learn coding as well, like with so many different languages, like me when I was 7 and I had QBasic.
Oh boy, yeah.
I learned QBasic. Right. Yeah, I was a hacker girl. You get it. There you go.
One of us.
Yeah, I just don't know what the correct answer is to this problem. I just really don't know, because learning about statistics doesn't really help you either. It's not what the problem is.
Yeah, I think you're spot on that a huge problem is just data quality. And I think product analytics and client-side tracking in particular has been a big culprit of this, where we've made it really easy to just track random events, properties from various parts of your app, which is actually, in my opinion, the wrong way to do analytics. Like one like really simple thing is first of all, you shouldn't track things on client side where you can avoid it. You should track things from your servers or your backend. It's way more reliable. So pro tip, just do that. But other thing is, I think there's the event-based model for analysis, like forgetting where the events come from, like whether they're client side or not. There's the event-based way of thinking about analysis, which I think is actually a good mindset for analysis. That is, you have users, they did a sequence of things. You're trying to analyze how many users did A and then came back and did A, or how many users did A, then B, then C. That's actually a way better mental model for analyzing your products or your business than, okay, I have these 2 tables. How do I join them? And what window function do I use to combine them? Like the event-based model for analysis is really good. Now, the problem is event-based data is typically shit, right? It's just like random stuff that's tracked from your apps. But one thing we're seeing more of our customers adopting is they have events sitting in their backend systems already. Like let's say that you have a transactions table that's, like coming from, let's say, Shopify or your internal database. That is guaranteed to be correct. Like if that thing was wrong, then your app would be broken. So it's definitely correct. You can model that as events. All you need is a timestamp and a user ID, and then everything else is a property. And so you can turn tables that you have in your warehouse into events, and you get all the benefits of analyzing them in an event-based interface without all the messiness of like, oh, I tracked 15 different versions of transactions for all my client sites. Like, no, this is guaranteed absolutely correct. So I think that's maybe it's like a very niche mindset at the moment, but I'm seeing that growing of people realizing, actually, I don't need to add all this tracking to my app. I have the trustworthy data in my warehouse. I can just push that into a tool that's built for analyzing events. So that's the second thing. And then third thing, I'd say more generally for tracking is get your developers to give a shit about it. I think that's the number one way in which tracking breaks is the PMs really care. They fire a ticket over. The developer is like, let me just bang this out like right before shipping the feature, or usually after shipping the feature, just like, sure, I'll throw some tracking in. Versus if you get developers to think about it, they will design the libraries and the abstractions so tracking is clean. Like in the sense of, okay, here's a helper function. It makes sure these properties are always named this way, always snake case, always guaranteed to look like this. And just giving like, a small amount of care to that on the developer side is huge. Yeah, I have thoughts on how to make that happen, but I think that's a huge bottleneck is a lot of times developers.
No, I 100% agree. And I also would like to hear your thoughts on how to make that happen, because I think like local data governance, right? So like in a team, like the local, like, hey, here's my part of the product. I give you some freedom, like you need to adhere to some naming policies and some general kind of guidelines. I'm with you, right? Like, but like exactly, like make people give a shit. So how do we do this? So this is now the $100 million question. So like, how do I make engineers to care about data? I have definitely a way of doing this, but like, what is yours? So how would you get started on this?
I think there's two elements. There's a top down and bottom up. So top down is, why do we care about clean data in the first place? It's so that we can analyze what we're shipping to understand, is it moving the needle and we should double down, or should we pivot? And the reason we do that is, okay, engineers are a really expensive resource and investment we're making. Are we investing them in the right things? And ultimately, that's the root of that tree, right? Like both the VP of engineering or CTO and the CPO care about that same thing. Are we allocating our engineering team effectively on our product investments? So I think that's the top down thing, is getting the CTO or the VP of engineering to recognize, hey, I'm spending like $20 million on this engineering team, and I'm flying blind on, are there any of them making an impact or not, because the data is a mess. And it's actually in my control to fix that if I just push down to the engineers, hey, tracking needs to be baked in. But before you ship a feature, like just like you QA it, make sure there's tracking. That's the thing a CTO can say and be like, yeah, you're not going to get promoted, or you're not going to grow your career here if you don't give a shit about it. So I think that has to happen. There's no way around that really, because people respond to incentives, and the org chart is one of the strongest forces out there, just like gravity. But so that's one. And then the bottom up way is make doing the right thing the easy thing. And I think that's the tooling piece, right? Where, for example, just like, yeah, you define some naming convention, but most people want to do that. They define a naming convention. It's just easier to do that, but then there's no way to enforce it, right? And so I think that's the tooling thing that we're thinking about is, okay, how do we take these like very high leverage conventions, like naming conventions or not having duplicates in certain ways, whatever, and just encoding that and enforcing it? Because once it's enforced, in the same way that, developers don't want to break code. And so you just needed a way to enforce code didn't break, and that's how you got CI/CD. And now, apps are much more reliable. Same thing, CI/CD, it's just applying developer tooling to data. It's just, when you're ingesting data, make sure it doesn't violate these constraints that you've set up. That's the more like make it easy to do the right thing approach. But I think you need both. I think if the CTO or VP Eng doesn't understand the data quality is affecting their visibility on how their teams are operating, then it's not going to work.
Yeah, I think from the mechanical side, I'm 100% with you. I would say like one important dimension that we also need to have for anyone to give any shit about what's happening in their team is that they understand the other side of the business as well. So what I mean with that is that I've seen way too many product teams where engineers are just being treated as ticket monkeys in terms of like, hey, we have Jira, so therefore I can make a ticket, and then I'm going to ask them every morning on where the ticket is, and that's the entire working relationship that they have. This does not work. It does not work. Why? Why does it not work? It does not work because you have this top-down approach that we just do not want to have in companies in general now on a very, very small kind of scale, which means you remove the entire business context. Why should an engineer know what the purposes of the work that they're doing? You could have a very, a dystopian view of like what an engineer does in terms of like, oh, but they need to just make the code. Like, yeah, it doesn't matter whether you understand as an engineer what the purpose is for what you're building, because you might be the only person that might be actually saying like, hey, maybe that's not the best approach because we could do it the other way, because a product manager does not know necessarily what an engineer could do otherwise if they had the context. And this goes both ways, right? Like it goes also the other way around. This is why I think these cross-collaborative teams really, like from the bottoms up, where we hold the entire team accountable. This is how I do it actually right now. Like I'm not just saying like, oh, the product manager didn't deliver, now they're getting axed. It's more like, hey, you as a team, you're responsible. I think this is also extremely important. Plus the mechanical ways that you also said. And then I think you have a good recipe for going forward.
Yeah, totally agree with that. Actually, maybe that's a flaw in my description. Is when I say top down, I think it's more that the CTO needs to or VP needs to own that it's a priority. I completely agree that just mindlessly telling engineers like fill out this tracking plan, it's not going to work. It's more like the mindset shift of, hey, if you've shipped something and you can't tell how people are using it or adopting it in a consistent way, that doesn't count, or it doesn't mean it's not meaningful. And getting all the tech leads of the teams to recognize that, I agree, that's the big cultural.
For sure, 100%. No, I think we're aligned. Let me ask you a very provocative question. I don't know whether you have an opinion on this, because I saw this also today, also on LinkedIn. Do you think that this constellation from, like, let's say we have three functions that need to be fulfilled with the product and the engineering organization. So we have the product that needs to be developed and maintained in some kind of way. Then we have the engineering organization in as a whatever, like with the CTO at the top and so forth. And then you have growth. So it's always a fun discussion to kind of figure out like where growth goes. I firmly believe that it goes to product, at least in most of the companies, because it should not be a sales function. It really shouldn't. That's also not what I mean with it. I just mean about, like this optimization of how do customers go through whatever we have as frictionless as possible and so forth. So if we think about growth in that function, then do you think the CPO and CTO should be a combined kind of position? Or do you think that a structure where you have a CPO and then a head of engineering is more favorable, or like CTO and then a head of product and so forth? Because this was an interesting discussion that I had, because I'm a little bit skeptical that the CTO, CPO dual head can work, because you have exactly like two, like on the same level that maybe should not be. I don't know. Like, I'm not sure I have an opinion on it very directly, but I suspect that a lot of problems are actually stemming from one silo not being able to take the lead when it sometimes makes sense in specific industries, specifically on security products, or like when we talk about really, really deep technical integrations where you just need to have a CTO over a CPO.
Yeah, I think they need to be aligned for sure. Whether that needs to mean that they're one person, I don't know if that's necessarily true. When I say they need to be aligned, I think it's, again, on that tree of, okay, you're trying to drive revenue. Here's the bets that we're going to make to drive revenue. Where they need to be aligned is, how are we staffing these bets for success, and how will we know they're successful? And are we aligned that these are the important bets to make? Once that's true, I think that there's a whole host of responsibilities that a head of engineering or CTO has that are different than what the product organization is doing. Like, there's a lot of overlap, like once they've aligned on that. But then there's also the technical excellence and making sure that you're choosing the right stack that'll set you up to deliver faster long-term, like just making sure speed of execution compounds, engineering hiring, because that's often one of the largest organizations you have in a product company. And it's hard to hire engineers. So like, how do you scale that? Engineering management, there's so much there that it seems like a disservice to force that to be one person that's also thinking about product and strategy and things like that. So I don't think it needs to be the same, but I completely agree. If there's not alignment there, it could be a big source of dysfunction, because you can't really solve it at the IC level, which often is what happens. It's like ICs are hearing different things and then they just never get aligned, and then a PM, I can't deliver. And then the engineer is like, I don't trust my PM. And then, never the twain shall meet. One thing I would say is, like, escalating is often underrated. I think people, like high potential teams, they struggle to escalate, or they escalate the wrong way, right? Like the PM escalates to their manager, which escalates to CPO, the engineer just escalates theirs. I think the best escalations, I actually got, like, I heard this from an interview. When I was interviewing a candidate, they were telling me like how to effectively escalate. Shout out Brian from Mixpanel. But he was saying that like the effective escalation is when you jointly escalate, where you both write up like, hey, I disagree with these things. I disagree with these things. Here's the other person's point of view. We were both saying, hey, to both our managers, what do you do about it? And ultimately those escalations will reach the CPO and CTO. And that's how they're even informed enough to understand, oh, wait, actually we're misaligned in this fundamental way. So I think it's actually, alignment's key. And often it's hard to tell if you're not aligned unless you get that feedback up from your team, right? Like joint escalation. So yeah, tactically, that's the one thing I do, but I don't think they need to be the same person, except in technical products. I do agree at like, let's say a Datadog or I don't know, like a observability company or database company. Yeah, probably it should be the same person because like the biggest risk that you're like able to even build the thing. And so that's really, yeah.
I find that quite interesting. So, like on the escalation topic, like maybe just like as a last point, I really, really like this. I don't think it's bad if you escalate things. Like, I don't know why people have such a hard time with escalating stuff sometimes as well. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. Specifically, like, I have also sometimes issues with my other leaders in the C level where I'm just saying, like, I'm not budging from here. I'm sorry, I can't. Like, I just have a different opinion than you, and that's fine. And now we're going to ask the CEO, and that's okay. And I just don't think there is such much. I don't think this is such a big problem. It's like it's the job of the CEO and the manager that is above you to kind of deal with conflicts like these. And it doesn't mean that someone is underperforming or something like this. But I've never heard the concept of like, hey, you know, like what? Let's just escalate it together. You know, like let's write the kind of like the opinion, like here's the dissenting opinion and the one that is actually for it and so forth. So I really like that. I'm definitely going to
Yeah,
take
please
that.
do. It's quite effective. Otherwise, you get these echo chambers where it's like product isn't their own line. Like, oh my God, engineering doesn't know what they're doing. They're so out of touch. And engineering is like product makes all these stupid decisions. And then it's,
We never hear sentences like that, do we? Never, never. Of course not. Yeah, everything is happy times. So maybe a last question to you in regards to, do you have any typical insights that you would say make the most sense for companies once they have, like, let's say they never do, like they have their data, as you said, you know, like they have their transactional data, they have maybe even some product data, you know, like they were tracking some stuff, but they never really analyzed it. Is there something where you believe like, hey, this is usually a really good way on just like get some kind of first insights, just like you said from before, you know, like on the transactional data, like, hey, look, let's look at some stuff over there and so forth. So for instance, a very typical one would be that you take the best customers that you have based on revenue. You can take those as well. And then you just see like how did they onboard into your product back in the day? And then we try to find some comparability there. Maybe I just took the best tip, I don't know, for myself, but do you have anything that you would say like this is usually a really good insight that people can get from their data if they've never done it?
yeah, there's plenty of tactical things there. Like, can you just answer what is your weekly active users? What is your week one retention rate? I'm using week, assuming that's the usage frequency of your product. Maybe it's daily, maybe it's monthly, depends on the product. But can you do weekly active users, retention rate, and then time to convert to some key action, which is usually a transaction, and the conversion rate? Just those baseline things, which you don't need a lot of tracking for. And frankly, you don't need any tracking for them. You just need to, usually this data is sitting in your transactional database. Like, for example, in an e-commerce or in a subscription style app, you probably have this data sitting somewhere of who renewed their subscription each month. That's one event. Like that's one thing you need to load into a tool like Mixpanel to answer all three of those questions. So you don't need like a 50 line spreadsheet to make a tracking plan. You just need that one event and you get tons of value. Then a follow-up question to that is, okay, segment that in some way. It's segmented by type of transaction, segmented by where the user came from, segmented by whatever else. You need one property on those events for each of those questions. That alone, frankly, a lot of companies don't have that level of insight that they can trust, like just basic that set of things. So I think that's a good, like, hey, that's a stepping stone. Cool, we've got some data set up. And then I think the next thing is on some cadence, your executive team is planning for the whole company and they have some open questions. I think if you're looking to make an impact through data, just asking them, hey, what do you wish you knew to make the decisions you need to make as a business? For example, an executive might wonder, should we be focusing on acquiring new customers or retaining existing customers? Or do we have a churn problem in one of our regions or segments that we should be focused on? That's a question they need to get answered, and they may not have an easy way to answer it. It's tough to write SQL to get it. Maybe you do write SQL as an executive, but it's at like 9 p.m. at night and you have no idea if it's right or wrong. And just what are your unanswered questions, executive team? And then, hey, let me go figure out how to get those answered. That is insanely impactful. And it's just working backward from a real problem you have rather than just tracking everything for no reason. And then the final step, I think, is just like doing that by default, right? Like you do that every quarter, you have some process, like we call it quarterly product reviews, just like sales has QBRs, like quarterly business review, we have quarterly product review. And that's where we look at every one of our investment areas, look at a standard template of metrics, which I'm happy to share. We can make it public and just look at, okay, did we move the needle on these things? What are some qualitative learnings we had? And that's published the whole company. So there's a forcing function on a cadence to get your data in order because you know you have to present at the meeting every quarter. that I think is like the final step to going wall to wall. That like a lot of things just get like cleaned up and happen effectively that way. But yeah, that would be my hierarchy of data.
I like that. I think what you're saying is, well, like, don't try to do everything, like, like a project where you try to fix like or track like 400 metrics and then you hope there is like a huge report coming out at the end and then it's a project that is kind of done. It never is done. And I think I really like this. Like, one thing that really has helped me quite a lot is to just, without asking, go with insights that I have from my kind of silo. So, like from the product as a CPO, and I go to sales and tell them like, hey guys, do you know that this and this stuff is actually happening? Is this interesting for you? Like, for instance, like product qualified leads or anything like that is coming out from product-led sales or whatever. Like, hey, someone that is doing this particular thing in the product is activating more likely. Do you also see this like in the sales calls? Does this line up with what you do and so forth? This might be a question that a sales leader is not asking you proactively because they just simply don't know that it is possible. So whatever function you are occupying actually might make sense to be proactive about this. And then another very, very classical thing is like highly encouraged to join people who use the same products as you or communities. There's a lot of them out there as well. Or you just call up someone else in a comparable company and just ask them, hey, can you tell me like which 2 or 3 metrics did you start to look at the start that were giving you some insights? Much more powerful than getting lost in this shitty ass projects where you try to just consolidate 400 metrics and just bring everything in order. I just don't think it works.
100% agree. And it's a great point on the community thing. I think that's one great thing about being in product and growth is we're all figuring it out. There's no best practices the way there are in other fields. Like, it's all being written. It's all first principles. I found that just cold outbounding to other product leaders, just asking for help, which is what I did when I switched to product. I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing. Can you help me? The hit rate is surprisingly high. Like, people want to be helpful, especially in product. I would happily be helpful to people if they'd message me like, hey, can you help me with this? 'Cause it's hard and no one knows what they're doing. So
this is such a good point. I love that you're saying this because I also had yesterday someone in my cohort to ask like, hey, so is there some standard material on the stuff that you just said yesterday about, like, is there literature around? And I'm like, dude, no, there's not. It's just, it's like, we're really trying to figure it out. It's just like, this is the stuff that actually works for us. And you figuring out the first principles for yourself is maybe the defensible mode for the business to go forward. But no, there is no study for this, right? Like, it just isn't. And I agree with you, like, rather than asking me for sitting together for 30 minutes and pick my brain or whatever they always say, like, just state your problem, reach out, and I'm happy to give an answer as well. Like, I do that quite often still. Okay, cool. So now then the question is, you already answered it kind of, like, do you want people to get in contact with you? And if so, how should they do that? Can they contact you on LinkedIn? Should they do it through Mixpanel? How should I get in contact with you?
Yeah, if you just have general questions about product development or anything was interesting here and you want to workshop a particular problem, just message me on LinkedIn. I'm usually pretty responsive there. I also love feedback about Mixpanel. And for that, just email me. It's my first name at Mixpanel. And that way I can loop in other people on the team that might be helpful. But yeah, really open. I'd love to just hear from the community, hear feedback.
That sounds really good. So thank you for spending this hour with me. It was really, really cool. And I hope you have a nice day. Thank you. And that's it. Thank you so much for listening to The Product Tea with Lea. If you don't have enough yet, you can subscribe to my podcast right now on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or you can head to my website, leatarin.com, which is leahtharin.com, where you can find much more of my material or just want to work with me.